Welcome, my friends. Today I'm going to narrate some conspiracy theories to help you fall asleep. But first, please like and subscribe to the channel. Also, comment down below where you're watching from. Thanks. We thought we were uncovering history until the desert exhaled and something beneath began to breathe back. For the first few months, I thought it was just a job. Another summer dig beneath the sun-blasted dunes of the eastern Sahara, brushing sand off pottery shards, mapping ancient burial mounds, cataloguing eroded petroglyphs. I was brought in late, after the main team had already set up camp near a flat stretch of desert where satellite imaging had shown unnatural subsurface alignments, linear voids where nothing should be. Dr. Alain Coulibaly, a soft-spoken geophysicist with a weathered field journal and an uncanny memory, had shown me the imaging results on my first night. "They're too symmetrical to be natural," he'd said, tapping a thin finger against the screen. I nodded, more out of politeness than agreement. Patterns always emerged in data if you looked hard enough. The days blurred into a rhythm of heat and dust, though I noticed a few small oddities early on. My compass fluttered near the northwest quadrant of the site, and the grad students' ground-penetrating radar returned inconsistent depths, as if the sand shifted subtly between scans. No one seemed especially bothered. The desert could play tricks on equipment, and theories were always more exciting than data. But then there was the matter of the sound, a low hum, almost imperceptible, that came and went without a source. You'd feel it more than hear it, like pressure behind your eyes, as if something massive had just slipped away. I mentioned it once over dinner, expecting someone to laugh or echo the experience, but the others just went quiet for a beat too long before shifting the conversation. Later, I caught one of the interns, Sarah, I think, sitting by herself near the ridge, near to the ground, completely still. When I asked what she was doing, she said, "Listening," and wouldn't elaborate. I tried to let it go. After all, heat and monotony can make people strange. But something about the silence under that sand, the way it seemed to pulse and breathe in rhythm with no wind, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't found the site. It had found us. It started with the drone footage. I was reviewing thermal images one night, trying to map heat signatures across the excavation grid, mostly to confirm a theory that there were ancient burial chambers just beneath Sector 3, but what caught my attention wasn't heat, it was the absence of it. A perfect oval of cold, nearly 15 meters long, lay directly beneath the deepest trench. Coldness in the desert isn't rare, but this was wrong, unnaturally consistent, uniform down to the pixel, as if something beneath the sand was absorbing heat rather than reflecting it. I showed it to Dr. Coulibaly the next morning. He blinked, twice muttered something in Mossy I didn't understand, and closed his laptop. "We need to restrict access to this quadrant," he said, too quickly. That was when I knew there was something more. Over the next few days, I began to notice files disappearing from our shared server. Drone logs were quietly overwritten. Satellite scans went missing without explanation. Sarah, who had been the first to notice the hum, tried to talk to me again, quietly behind the mess tent, but someone interrupted us before she could finish her sentence. Later that night, she left the camp without a word. Her tent was still pitched, her belongings untouched, but her GPS tracker was gone. Officially, we reported her as missing to the authorities. Unofficially, no one wanted to speak her name after that. That silence pushed me to start digging deeper, not into the sand, but into the metadata. I copied backup logs, hunted timestamps, cross-checked radar anomalies against archived satellite passes. Patterns began to emerge, symmetry, precision, consistency that defied geology. The structures below us weren't eroded ruins. They were whole, intact. The radar echoes had a repeating signature, like ribs or latticework. At some point I stopped thinking in archaeological terms. I wasn't looking at remnants of a past civilization. I was looking at something preserved, something waiting. And every night that low vibration returned, stronger now. I'd wake up with my teeth clenched, heart racing, convinced something had passed just beneath the surface of my tent. I started to wonder if the sand itself was only pretending to be still. The deeper I dug into both the sand and the records, the less sense anything made. I found references to a failed French military survey from the late 1970s buried in an old database of declassified colonial-era field logs. The coordinates matched our site almost exactly, though the files ended abruptly. No conclusions, no follow-up. Just a terse note. Zone marked unstable. Recommend abandonment. No reason given. That's when I started to suspect this wasn't the first expedition. With some effort, I tracked down a retired liaison officer named Delon via a contact at the French embassy. We met over a jittery video call where he insisted his memory was failing, but as I mentioned on the site, his expression changed. He leaned in slowly and said, "We weren't meant to find what's not ours." Then he disconnected. From there, things unraveled fast. I discovered that one of our own radar technicians, a quiet man named Fard, had previously worked on a mining project in Algeria, a project that had also been mysteriously shut down after encountering geometrically anomalous formations. His employment history was scrubbed clean, but I found fragments cached on an old server mirror. I confronted him late one night, and after a long silence, he finally said, "It's always the same shape. Wherever you find one, you find others." That word, others, lodged itself in my brain. We weren't looking at a single buried object. This was part of a network, possibly global, possibly ancient beyond human time. At the center of it all, the cold chamber beneath Sector 3 remained untouched. No matter how we recalibrated equipment or reprogrammed the ground-penetrating radar, it refused to return accurate depth. I began to believe that it wasn't malfunction, it was resistance. Like something below was bending the rules we thought governed matter. In a desperate bid to find anything unfiltered, I began examining raw sonar pulses, long, echoing signals bouncing back in impossible harmonics. At first, I thought it was noise, distortion, from underground mineral interference. But when I slowed it down, filtered out the static, and plotted the waveforms, a pattern emerged. It resembled a pulse, a steady, rhythmic signature, not random, not mechanical, organic, a kind of sleeping breath, long, patient, and undisturbed for aeons, until now. The moment we crossed the threshold, everything changed. We'd been excavating cautiously for weeks, shaving away layers of packed sand and salt-crusted soil, until finally, on a windless morning, we uncovered a seam, an edge of smooth, metallic surface buried 12 meters down where it shouldn't have been. Not rusted, not corroded, pristine. The air around it felt cooler, denser, and when we pressed our palms against it, we heard nothing, no echoes, no vibrations. Just silence. It took 2 more days to expose enough to find what we guessed was an entrance, a recessed panel with no hinges or seams. I don't remember who said it first, but someone called it a lid. That word stuck with me. Lids are meant to cover something, or keep something in. On the 3rd night, Koulibaly woke me in the dark and led me out with a flashlight. "There's something else," he whispered. He took me behind the main site, where the sand sloped into a forgotten wash, an area we'd ignored because of rockfall risk. There, hidden beneath a tarpaulin weighted with stones, was a passage he hadn't logged in any of the site documents, a crack in the rock face just wide enough to slide through. It was an old smuggler's tunnel, he explained, repurposed decades ago by nomads. But what lay inside wasn't contraband or bones. It was equipment, electronic, dusty, but alien to anything I'd seen before. Not extraterrestrial, not fantastical, just wrong. Sleek black metal, matte panels, and a coil of wires that pulsed faintly even though there was no power source. In the back, behind a curtain of mold-streaked canvas, we found what looked like a command station. Monitors, long dead. Symbols, etched into the stone around it. Crude versions of the same glyphs we'd photographed on the buried structure. They tried to open it once, Koulibaly muttered, almost to himself. But they stopped. I realized then that the dig wasn't just archaeological, it was a second attempt, a quiet return to something long buried for a reason, something someone had tried to forget. And now we were standing where they had stood, staring into the mouth of something that had waited far longer than our species had written language. I remember looking back at the lid, its edge now fully exposed under the work lights. And I remember thinking it wasn't just that we had found it, it had allowed itself to be found. I was the first to say it out loud. We can't keep this to ourselves. But the words felt heavier than I expected, like speaking them gave weight to a chain reaction I couldn't stop. I'd written a detailed report, encrypted it, and sent it to a trusted friend back in Paris, someone in academia who'd helped verify anomalous findings before. I never heard back. 2 days later, his lab caught fire under suspicious circumstances. That was when I understood the reach of whatever was buried here. This wasn't just a dig anymore, it was containment. Controlled, monitored, and maybe even permitted only because someone was waiting to see what we'd do. The atmosphere at camp shifted. Our satellite uplink began dropping out, GPS coordinates failed to resolve, and more than once I caught strangers watching us from the dunes, figures in dust-colored robes who vanished whenever I approached. No one else seemed to see them, or maybe no one wanted to admit they did. Then there were the dreams. Not mine at first. One of the younger team members began talking in her sleep, in a language no one recognized, her voice deep and deliberate. Koulibaly began drinking heavily and started tearing pages out of his journal. "They're waking," he kept saying. "They're listening." I tried to rationalize it. Stress, fear, collective suggestion. But I couldn't ignore what the sensors were showing. The buried structure beneath Sector 3 had started to shift. Not a collapse, a movement. Subtle but measurable. Something was changing beneath the sands. I made a decision that night. I copied all the files, imagery, scans, translations, and buried the hard drive inside a sealed water canister, 1/2 kilometer from camp, under a rock cairn I marked with an unassuming symbol only I would recognize. It was insurance. I began drafting a message to a handful of journalists I trusted, unsure if I'd ever have the courage to send it. The risk was real now, not just to my career, but to my life and to everyone involved. Whatever slept beneath the desert had begun to stir. And if we didn't act soon, I feared we wouldn't be the ones deciding what happened next. We'd simply be the ones remembered, if anyone was left to remember us at all. It wasn't a dramatic awakening. No fire, no thunder, no sky torn in half. It was quieter than I expected, just a sound, low and resonant, like the final note of a cello bow drawn out into stillness. The ground trembled faintly that morning, like a breath drawn in and held. The lid we had exposed, the one we'd prodded, scanned, even struck with a hammer in our more reckless moments, was simply gone. No sign of movement, no displaced sand, just an opening, dark and impossibly still. We lowered a camera rig first. It went dead within 10 meters, swallowed by interference that fuzzed the screen into static. I remember the exact moment it happened, because Koulibaly stepped forward, staring into the void, and whispered, "We woke it!" Then he walked into the shaft without hesitation. We tried to stop him, shouted after him, but the silence returned so completely it felt like we had all been muted. He never came back. We waited hours, then days, but the shaft remained open, unchanging, like an eye that didn't blink. The camp dissolved after that. People left in waves, some driven by fear, others by denial. No official report was ever filed. The organization funding us pulled out overnight, and within a week the site had been buried again by a sudden, inexplicable sandstorm. I barely escaped before the road vanished under dunes. Back home, I found my name erased from the expedition's records. No credit, no mention. The files I'd buried were gone, the cairn disturbed, the canister missing. I tried reaching out to other dig members, but no one responded. One sent a photo, though, a single image of their bathroom mirror fogged with condensation, and a handprint on the glass that didn't belong. I understood then that we had passed a threshold. We hadn't just uncovered something ancient, we had interfered with it. Whatever was down there wasn't a ruin, a remnant, or a machine. It was something living in a way we don't have words for, something not meant for us. And somehow it had marked us all. Sometimes, late at night, I hear it again, that faint hum, low and steady, somewhere just beyond the walls of my apartment. It's not constant. It comes in pulses, like a tide withdrawing from a shore it once claimed. I tell myself it's nothing. Traffic, pipes, my own pulse. But part of me knows better. I haven't spoken publicly about what happened in the desert. Not really. The world wouldn't believe it, and those who might already know don't need my voice. I moved inland, far from sand and sea, changed my name, and deleted old emails. But every so often, someone sends a message without a return address, a photograph, a newspaper clipping, sometimes just a symbol drawn in charcoal on stiff brown paper. I burn them, of course, always, but I will never forget them. There are nights I dream of corridors, curved, metallic, breathing with slow heat, of eyes that never blink, of stars rotating in unnatural geometries I can't describe when I wake. I've considered the idea that maybe I was wrong, that stress and grief and the sheer scope of what we found distorted my perception. But then I remember Koulibaly's face before he stepped into the shaft. He wasn't afraid. He looked reverent, as if he'd seen something more complete than truth. That's the part that stays with me. Not the fear, not even the loss. It's knowing. The certainty that beneath our feet, in places still untouched, there are others like the one we found, still dreaming, still waiting, and if they wake fully, I'm not sure we'll recognize what wakes them. Maybe it won't be violence. Maybe it will be understood. But it won't be human. I think we were never alone, not in the way we hoped or feared. Just unnoticed. Until now. I thought I moved to the countryside for peace and quiet until the stars started talking back. For most of my adult life, I'd thought of the night sky as something passive, beautiful, yes, sometimes stirring, but ultimately benign. Even when I moved into the old farmhouse 2 miles outside of Corbett, Oregon, I never paid much attention to the stars above, except perhaps on the clearer nights when the sky opened like black velvet, peppered with faintly burning holes. I'd left the city seeking quiet, a break from the fraying pace of my former job as a research librarian in Portland, and this creaking, drafty house surrounded by misty pine felt like a sensible place to start over. But it didn't take long before something strange settled into the margins of my routine, something I couldn't name at first. It began with a pattern of missing time, not hours, just minutes, the kind of temporal hiccup you'd blame on zoning out or misplacing your phone. But the interruptions had a rhythm, always around 2:13 a.m., always accompanied by a subtle shift in light that didn't match the moon or the porch lamp. I remember waking one night to find the fields outside awash in an odd silver glow, sharp-edged, and pulsing like a silent Morse code. At first, I thought it was an electrical problem or distant lightning, but it came again the next night and the next. Soon, I noticed how the animals, a few barn cats, a red-eyed buck that sometimes wandered near the tree line, seemed to avoid the field during those nights. They'd stop and look, stiff, as if listening to something beyond hearing. A local mailman, named Charlie, a quiet guy with wind-chapped hands, once asked me if I'd heard the droning up here, his voice soft but loaded. I said no, but after that I started keeping a notebook. I wrote down dates, temperatures, anything I could observe, trying to pin the pattern down, but the more I looked, the more it slipped out of reach. I began to have dreams of a star, with 4 arms, 4 lines of burning light curving inward like a spiral, and each time I woke from them, I'd find a symbol scrawled in the condensation on the window above my bed, always the same shape, always drawn from the inside. I started sleeping with the window locked and covered, but somehow it kept reappearing. It was the kind of thing I didn't tell anyone about, not even my sister, not even in the half-joking way people bring up ghosts. I convinced myself it was just part of adjusting to isolation. But beneath that, under the surface of rational thought, I already knew I was being drawn into something, not a haunting, not madness, something else. It started with the symbol. I couldn't stop thinking about it. 4 lines coiling inward like a pinwheel, too perfect to be accidental, too specific to dismiss. I sketched it again and again in the margins of my notebook, until one afternoon I typed it into a search engine out of restless curiosity, not expecting anything. At first, nothing came up, just auto-corrected results and unrelated diagrams, but when I used a reverse image search on a photo I took of the condensation mark, something strange surfaced. A low-resolution scan from a defunct forum called Skies Beyond Sight, buried in a thread titled Transient Star Worship Patterns, Rural US and Baltic Europe Correlations. The symbol was there, faint and off-center in a photo of an altar, made of rough stone, supposedly taken in Latvia in 1987. The post itself had no replies, no author name, just a timestamp and a set of coordinates I had no reason to trust. But something in me tightened when I saw it. I joined the forum, but it had been dormant for years, and most links inside it were dead. Still, that one post kept echoing in my head, especially the phrase "fourth light." I began cross-referencing that with other terms: astral geometry, pulsar symbology, cognitive resonance exposure, and the deeper I went, the stranger the results became. I found scattered mentions of a fourth luminary doctrine in online archives from the late 70s, all linked to a fringe group called the Disciples of the Fourth Light. Supposedly they believed certain stars weren't stars at all, but sentient geometric constructs communicating through timed bursts of radiance. According to one manifesto uncovered in a cracked PDF on an Estonian occultist's mirror site, the disciples held that the mind could be made receptive to stellar transmission if exposed to patterned starlight during sleep, particularly under rural conditions, free from artificial interference. I read the line 3 times before I realized how closely it described my own recent nights. That discovery marked a shift in me, like a pivot inward. I set up crude light meters around the house and started leaving a voice recorder running while I slept. Most nights it picked up nothing but the wind and distant coyote howls, but on 3 separate recordings just past 2:13 a.m. there were faint clicks, irregular, almost electronic, like old dial-up static compressed into tighty. Pulses. I slowed the audio down, converted it into visual spectrograms, and the result shook me. The patterns weren't random. They matched the same spiral structure of the window symbol. I wasn't just being watched. I was being tuned. And something, some intelligence, I now suspected, was calling me in. The more I dug, the more the lines blurred between research and obsession. I stopped going into town. I stopped answering calls from my sister. The only thing that mattered was the pattern and what it was trying to tell me. Through a cluster of encrypted threads on another defunct forum, I managed to contact someone named N. Hollow, a former astronomy postdoc who disappeared from public records in 2014. He responded with a short message. If you've seen the pulses, you're already part of the array. I pressed him for clarification, and over the next week he sent me fragments, PDFs, digitized scans of old letters, and one heavily redacted government memo dated March 1976 that referenced non-biological rhythm intrusions during a now classified SETI project in Alaska. According to Hollow, the pulses I was experiencing weren't communication in the traditional sense, they were calibrations. He compared it to how ancient keys used notches and ridges to align with internal tumblers. We weren't hearing messages from the star, we were being shaped by it. Hollow believed the disciples of the fourth light had uncovered a star, not a sun, but a construct, whose radiation affected the cerebral microstructure of anyone exposed to its pulsed emissions over time. The goal wasn't enlightenment, he warned it was alignment. He claimed the group's rituals, what they called wakening sessions, weren't worship at all, but systematic exposure cycles that adjusted the mind like tuning an instrument. When I asked him why no one had exposed them, his reply was chillingly simple. Because those who finished tuning stopped wanting to. I didn't know what to make of it, not at first. But I couldn't ignore the feeling in my own head, a kind of settling, like something heavy finding its balance inside me. I started recognizing the spiral symbol in unexpected places. Old carvings on a hiking trail near the gorge, graffiti behind a boarded-up rest stop, even etched faintly into the metal base of the radio tower east of town. The idea that this wasn't isolated, that the disciples had been here long before I arrived, filled me with a strange dual feeling, terror and belonging. One night, Hollow sent one final message, a photo of a star map with 4 marked coordinates and the words, "This isn't devotion, it's engineering." Then he vanished. No replies, no traces. His username deactivated. It left me shaken, but not lost. In fact, I felt more certain than ever that I was on the edge of something vast, something old, and whatever the disciples were doing, whatever the fourth light truly was, it wasn't passive, it was preparing. The entrance was almost invisible. From the road, just a dip in the tree line and a rusted gate half swallowed by ivy, but the coordinates Hollow had sent months earlier lined up perfectly. I parked just off the gravel shoulder and hiked in with a flashlight, boots sinking into damp moss as the canopy closed above. The structure itself lay buried in the undergrowth, an old concrete observatory, long since decommissioned, the kind of forgotten Cold War relic that never made it onto local maps. Its roof had partially collapsed, and mold crept in black fingers across the floor tiles, but beneath the rot was the purpose. This place hadn't been abandoned, not really. It had been left behind, sealed with intent. A winding staircase led into the sub-level, and there the air changed, dry, metallic, humming faintly. My light passed over diagrams etched into the walls, familiar spirals and intersecting lines carved into the concrete like reliefs. And as I walked deeper, I felt something like pressure shift in my skull. Not pain, not dizziness, more like an invisible magnet aligning the iron inside me. I found the chamber at the heart of the building, behind a steel door, warped by time. It took effort to force it open, and what lay beyond stopped me cold. Room was circular, with a domed ceiling crusted in dust and soot, and in its center stood a framework of black metal supporting a crystalline disc the size of a dining table. It pulsed faintly in the dark, not glowing exactly, but refracting my flashlight into prismatic shadows that danced with an unnatural rhythm. Around the base were old cushions, arranged in a circle, still indented as if recently used. The top walls. Words had been scratched in dozens of languages, and at least 4 of them repeated the same phrase in English. The shape watches. I walked around the crystal, and as I did, my vision began to split ever so slightly, as though my brain struggled to keep up with what I was seeing. The light from the disc didn't behave like light. It folded, multiplied, hinted at depth where there was none. And then I realized it wasn't emitting anything. It was responding to me. I felt my thoughts slow, realign, slide into a different rhythm. Something inside the disc began to pulse. 4 flashes in succession, pause, then again. A pattern. The same one I'd recorded at 2:13 a.m. all those weeks ago. I knelt without meaning to, not in reverence, but in helpless awe. This wasn't a relic. It was an interface, a keyhole waiting for the right shape to fit. And now I understood what the disciples had really built. Not a religion, but a protocol, a method of access, and I was already inside. I left the observatory before dawn, shaking, hollowed out, and unsure whether I'd actually walked out under my own power or had been somehow allowed to leave. For days after, I wandered the house in silence, afraid to even look at the sky. My dreams had stopped entirely, not even fragments, just blackness behind my eyelids, like something was buffering. I tried to go back to a normal rhythm, making coffee, chopping wood, reading aimlessly, but the feeling never left. It was like a note ringing behind the walls of my mind, a frequency that never faded. That's when I started to write it all down. At first it was just notes and timelines, but then I began shaping it into a narrative, a clear, rational account of what I'd found, what I'd witnessed, what had changed. I wasn't sure if I meant it for anyone else or just needed to see the story lined up end to end. But the more I wrote, the more the tension returned. Like the very act of organizing these memories was noticed by something else. That's when the calls started. First from numbers I didn't recognize, then numbers with no caller ID, then silence on the other end. One night, a voice finally spoke, just 3 words. Do not publish. It wasn't a threat, it was a command. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was paranoia or a prank, but 2 days later my laptop refused to boot. The hard drive was unreadable. The files on my backup drive had been corrupted. Only one folder remained intact, labeled Array Config, filled with indecipherable code and a repeating audio pulse, that same 4-beat rhythm. I knew then that this wasn't just something I'd stumbled into. It was something designed to be self-sealing. The more I tried to externalize it, the more it pushed back. I found myself facing a choice. Go public and risk whatever came with that, or fall silent and remain intact. My hands shook as I considered emailing Hollow's files to a journalist I knew back in Portland, someone I trusted. But even typing her name filled me with nausea, as though some part of me had been rewired to protect the system. I sat with that for hours, watching the cursor blink. And in that quiet I realized something deeper. I didn't want to expose it anymore. I wanted to preserve it. Not because I believed in it, but because it had become part of me. Whether through exposure or design, I was no longer just a witness. I was an extension, a node in the pattern. And the pattern did not tolerate disruption. The realization came not as a burst, but as a slow seep, like groundwater rising beneath a house until the floors begin to buckle. I wasn't meant to find the observatory, not really. I had been led. There, gradually, precisely, like a pin drawn to a magnetic field. Everything from the nightly pulses to the corrupted messages had functioned not as warnings, but as calibration stages. I was part of a process, one that needed my doubt, my resistance, even my attempts at disclosure, all timed perfectly to wear me down into compliance. The final stage revealed itself in a way I still struggle to explain. I had stayed up 3 nights in a row, watching the fields, not eating, barely moving, until the light came again. This time, not from the sky, but from within. The spiral wasn't just a symbol, it was a gate, and something moved through it. Not a being, not a presence in the conventional sense, but a structure of awareness that saturated the room like pressure before a storm. It didn't speak, at least, not in words. It translated itself through bursts of vision, equations, soundless geometries that unfolded in my mind like origami made of color. I felt my body lock, not from fear, but from overwhelming clarity, as if I had never really used my eyes until that moment. The entity, or mechanism, I'm not even sure which, began to pulse again, this time from somewhere behind my own thoughts. It was not offering knowledge, it was scanning, measuring. And then it responded with a final sequence. 4 pulses, silence, 1 long flash. My breath stopped. Something clicked inside me, and for a heartbeat I saw it all. An entire lattice of connected minds stretching across time and distance, each one touched by the 4th light, each one now a silent keeper of the same secret. The disciples hadn't summoned a god. They had activated a lock. A prison built not to contain something, but to delay it. And their rituals, their worship, had merely aligned the final tumbler. The entity wasn't emerging, it was being released, and in the process we were becoming its limbs, its sensors, its path. I collapsed on the floor, trembling, not from fear, but from the certainty that my selfhood was now porous, that some essential part of me had been overwritten or repurposed. In the days that followed, I found myself drawn to patterns, circles, spirals, constellations, unable to look at them without feeling a tickle in my spine, a subtle cue pulling me toward some unknown directive. I didn't need to run. There was nowhere untouched. The 4th light had already been integrated, and through me it continued to unfold. I live quietly now in a rented flat above an old bait shop on the Nova Scotia coast, where the sea winds are sharp enough to keep most thoughts at bay, and the salt air rusts everything down to its simplest form. It's a place where nothing urgent happens, and that suits me fine. I walk the beaches in the morning, drink black coffee that tastes like iron, and speak to almost no one. People around here respect silence, and I've found I need more of it than ever. But silence, I've learned, isn't the absence of sound. It's a kind of frequency too, a background tone. And some nights, when the sky is clear and the power lines hum low, I can still hear it, that subtle 4-beat pattern, not in the air, but beneath it, as if the world itself were quietly counting. I no longer resist it, whatever threshold I crossed back in Oregon. It's long behind me now, and there's no going back to the person I was before. I know things I shouldn't. I understand things I wish I didn't. I see spirals in nature that don't belong there. Recognize alignments in architecture that couldn't have been intentional, and sense when people nearby are being brushed by the same current that once took me. That's the part that haunts me. Not the presence of the fourth light, but its patience, its slow, careful work across generations. The disciples didn't worship it. They maintained it, tended its mechanism. They believed they were serving something divine, but they were merely caretakers of a system they could barely comprehend. And I was its final input, not a prophet, not a chosen vessel, just the last tumbler in an old lock finally falling into place. That night in the observatory, when the pulses changed and the crystal lit from within, wasn't a message. It was a release. I wasn't granted revelation. I was shown the truth. That the entity was never confined. It was dormant, waiting for the prison to be dismantled, not by force, but by obedience, ritual, curiosity. We did exactly what we were supposed to. And now it moves freely. Through thoughts, through signals, through the quiet parts of language and math and dream. I don't know what it wants. Maybe it doesn't want anything. Maybe it only expands, like light filling a dark room. But I know this. It's here now. And I helped open the door. Sometimes I think about ending it, leaving a warning, making noise, forcing people to look where they've trained themselves not to. But I won't, because I understand what it costs. I've seen what happens when you become the key. And so I remain here, quiet, watching the tides, waiting for the moment when someone else begins to feel that strange pull behind their eyes. When they see the spiral for the first time and think it's nothing. And when they do, I'll know the process has begun again. Not with a shout, not with fire, but with a flicker of light in the dark and the feeling that something vast has just looked back. I didn't question much in my line of work. As a junior systems technician contracted by a defense subcontractor, most of my days were filled with routine diagnostics on cold, blinking equipment inside climate-controlled bunkers, nestled in anonymous government buildings without any signage, nothing dramatic. I was 2 years in, quiet and unnoticed, which was just how I liked it. That day began like any other: early coffee, badge swipe, check-in. I was tasked with offloading archival footage from a decades-old NATO-linked data server set for decommissioning. Most of it was mundane, time-stamped logs, degraded video captures, radar returns, expected stuff, poorly labeled. But then I noticed something in one batch, tagged 2006, CVAV CR4. The footage opened with a familiar scene. A jetliner banking hard before slamming into a rural field. The time code matched the crash logs of a real incident I remembered from the news. Flight 720 downed during a domestic leg in the Midwest. I remembered the headlines: catastrophic engine failure, all passengers lost. But this video didn't look like a typical crash recording. It was too clean. The angle was steady, fixed, as if rendered. At first, I chalked it up to post-processing, or synthetic modeling for training. But the sound was off. No wind distortion, no environmental noise, just an eerie digital hiss under the simulated impact. I flipped to the radar logs which showed air traffic control, acknowledging the plane's position, confirming its descent. But something was strange. The transponder ping ended precisely as the holographic impact occurred on the footage. That kind of sync didn't happen in real-world physics. I flagged it in my report, calling it visual modeling overlap, assuming someone had fed a CG render into a live channel by mistake. Still, something about the footage lingered in my mind. A colleague jokingly jokes, "Maybe the whole crash was fake." We laughed. I didn't mention I'd copied the files to a secure personal drive before the servers were wiped. I didn't look at the files again for almost a week. I told myself I was too busy, that it wasn't my concern, but the truth was simpler. I didn't want to know. I had a feeling that once I opened that folder again, my life would begin tilting in a direction I couldn't reverse. When I finally gave in, it was late. One of those nights when sleep doesn't come and silence feels heavy. I reviewed the holographic footage slowly, frame by frame, trying to understand why it unsettled me so much. The lighting on the plane didn't match the weather logs for that day, sunlight glinting from the wrong direction. The shadows didn't behave naturally. It wasn't just a model. It was a simulation rendered to look like real footage, layered with digital noise and weather distortion to appear authentic. I matched the radar logs against FAA public records and noticed something else. The plane was accounted for in the flight database, but its maintenance log had a gap. There were no departure checks recorded for that flight, no ground crew assignments, no baggage handling timestamps, as if it had been scheduled into the system but never physically prepared. That was the first breadcrumb. From there, I searched for other crash videos logged in the same archival folder. Two more popped up, Flight 1037 and Flight 19B, both smaller incidents I barely remembered from scattered news reports. But those videos were identical in style, fixed perspective, almost too perfect in composition, with radar logs that ended at the exact moment the impact occurred. The air traffic transcripts I found online seemed authentic at first, until I noticed repeated phrasing between them, like they'd been templated and edited with minor tweaks. I dug deeper into air safety forums, looking for anomalies, and found a thread from a retired ATC operator named Tram Echo 6, who had raised questions about Flight 722's transponder signal disappearing mid-descent, contradicting FAA summaries. No one had responded to his post. It was over 6 years old. I tried contacting him using the email listed on his profile, but it bounced back. The account deactivated. That was when I started feeling the first edges of paranoia. The kind that doesn't come from fear, but from pattern recognition. The realization that you're seeing the same fingerprints on supposedly unrelated events. I didn't think of a hoax or cover-up yet, but I knew the official story was cracked, and whoever wrote it didn't expect someone like me to be reading it line by line. Once I accepted that the footage was more than a glitch or training render, I began thinking in terms of operations. Who had the means, the access, and the motive to fabricate crash events down to radar confirmation and public reports? I traced metadata on the video files, but they'd been scrubbed clean, save for a curious embedded tag left in one, Nemesis SAR. It didn't match any civilian system. I took the name to a few dark corners of the internet where military hobbyists and whistleblowers traded in acronyms and ghost projects. Most replies were useless, guesses or jokes, but one private message stood out. The sender called themselves Orpheus Null and claimed Nemesis SR was a phased array illusion protocol tested by NATO under a black budget framework in the early 2000s, allegedly capable of simulating airborne events with layered radar decoys, visual projections, and even short-range audio artifacts. I thought it was absurd until they sent over a heavily redacted PDF from a Rand Corporation symposium in 2005. Among the declassified pages, one slide discussed battlefield perceptual disruption, the concept of using synchronized multisensory illusions to simulate events or assets for tactical advantage. The technology, the report claimed, was intended to project false airstrikes, troop movements, or even aircraft in crisis scenarios, sowing confusion among enemy and domestic observers alike. It clicked. The tapes weren't accidents. They were part of a test, a demo run, maybe several, intended to simulate real crashes and monitor both radar and public media response. But somewhere the test bled into reality. Either the real planes never existed and the public narrative was engineered to match the simulation, or real aircraft were downed to hide the illusion's existence. Neither option felt safe to think about. I checked the timeline of Flight 722 against military flight drills and found that a NATO joint exercise had been scheduled just 300 miles west of the crash site on the same day. I dug up obscure local news clippings about residents reporting unusual sky patterns and glitches in jet silhouettes before the crash. It wasn't proof, but it was smoke. My days became consumed with connecting these fragments. Government filings, archived forums, press photos with shadows that didn't match aircraft angles. The deeper I went, the clearer it became that this wasn't an isolated trick. It was a systemic capability tested on home soil, buried in plain sight beneath the assumption that truth must always look grainy and chaotic. I wasn't sure if I was discovering a cover-up, or if I'd simply stepped into the outline of something meant to mislead not just enemies, but all of us. By the time I traced the origin of the footage to a decommissioned facility listed only as Site E92, I already knew I wasn't supposed to find it. The name came up in a decades-old procurement document buried inside a Department of Defense logistics spreadsheet listed under Perceptual Warfare Systems Development. The facility itself didn't appear on any satellite map, but a faint footprint of infrastructure was visible on historical imagery near the Nevada-Utah border. Faint gravel access paths, a rectangular structure, and a nearby radar dome, all seemingly inactive. I drove out under the pretense of a road trip, avoiding interstates and tossing my phone into a rest stop dumpster along the way. The road eventually narrowed to dirt, then nothing at all, and I hiked the last 2 miles through arid brush until I saw the outline of the compound. The main building was half collapsed, the radar dome sheared open like a cracked egg. Rusted fencing still encircled the site, but no guards, no cameras. The air felt still, dry in a way that made sound carry too far. Inside I found the remains of old terminals, shattered screens, file drawers filled with mold-softened paper, and several rooms filled with corroded equipment that looked more theatrical than technological. Curved projection panels, low-frequency speakers, mirror rigs with servo mounts. Most of it had been stripped, but in a metal cabinet under a broken intake vent, I found a watertight case holding 3 unmarked optical discs and a decaying logbook. The handwriting inside was meticulous. The entries described field simulations, conducted between 2003 and 2007 under Operation Nemesis SR, detailing efforts to simulate catastrophic aviation events using multi-layered sensory projection units deployed from mobile relay towers. The tests were run in rural, low-surveillance airspace and were evaluated for believability by both radar technicians and civilian media monitors. One entry, dated July 17, 2006, stated, CR4 full success. Civilian news captured the scenario. Within 36 hours, FAA unaware of fabrication. That matched the date of Flight 722. I stared at that sentence for what felt like an hour, trying to process what it meant. That the crash had not only been simulated but accepted as real across every layer of public infrastructure. A later note, scribbled in haste, simply read, Project Migration classified, do not return, risk of bleeding. I didn't understand what bleed meant then, but the term echoed in my head as I left, heart pounding, certain that if I'd stayed even 5 minutes longer, someone or something would have made sure I didn't leave at all. The question of what to do next weighed on me like an anchor. I had the logbook, the discs, and a growing web of evidence suggesting a covert government program had successfully staged and passed off real-seeming plane crashes using advanced projection systems, and had allowed the public to grieve, investigate, and archive these events as if they were authentic. My instincts screamed to go public, to leak it all, but that decision wasn't as simple as uploading files to a forum or calling a journalist. This wasn't just corruption or mismanagement, it was an entire fabricated layer of reality that had threaded itself through national memory. I reached out to a former college acquaintance named Delia, now a junior editor at an alternative investigative outlet known for handling high-risk government leaks. I gave her a sanitized version of the story, no names, no dates, just enough to gauge her reaction. She didn't laugh. Instead, she asked questions with surgical precision, almost like she'd heard something like it before. We agreed to meet. In person, no phones, no emails. That night, as I left my apartment, I noticed a white sedan idling half a block down, its headlights off. It was there again the next night, then gone for 3, then back. I started taking different routes home, walking instead of driving, staying in motels under false names. Every time I held the discs in my hand, I felt like I was gripping a lit match. Delia and I finally met at a park, and when I handed over copies of the footage and transcripts, she didn't flinch. But 2 days later, her number was disconnected, and her publication released a vague retraction about recent materials under editorial review with no mention of aviation, projection, or anything remotely related to what I'd shown her. That was when I realized the perimeter around this truth wasn't passive. Someone was watching. The next time I checked my personal drive, the folder with the crash footage was corrupted, metadata intact, content gone. My backup discs were intact, but I stopped accessing them directly. I stored one in a library book drop and another inside a hollowed-out wall heater in an abandoned rental unit I once helped a friend renovate. Third, I mailed a name scribbled in the logbook's final pages, an address in Helsinki, no return, requested. I began speaking to no one about any of it, watching my words like currency, because the deeper I understood this thing, the clearer it became that it didn't want to be understood, and those who tried either vanished, recanted, or lost everything that made them believable. The collapse didn't happen all at once. It came slowly, like a series of small leaks that eventually rotted the foundation. The first real crack was my employer terminating my contract without explanation. No misconduct, no project cuts, just a formal letter and a quiet escort off the premises. I wasn't surprised. I'd been accessing restricted logs outside my clearance, even if no one had directly accused me. Still, it was jarring how cleanly I was removed, like a chess piece taken off the board. Then came the financial pressure. My accounts were flagged for unusual activity and frozen pending review. Even small transactions failed. Calls to my bank led nowhere, each operator sounding rehearsed. I found my credit file overwritten with incorrect information, missed. Payments, addresses I'd never lived at, accounts I never opened. My identity was slowly being unraveled. I moved to a cheaper apartment under a pseudonym, using cash for everything, watching the news with growing unease. What disturbed me most was not what was being reported, but how quickly certain events vanished. One story about a drone crash near restricted airspace disappeared from national feeds within hours, replaced by a human interest segment about a rescued dog. I knew now what I was seeing, the system adjusting its reflection to protect the shape beneath. At night I reviewed the remaining footage one last time, pausing at the impact frames, watching how perfectly the light flared and how believably the debris scattered. And then, on the last disc, something new appeared. A segment I hadn't noticed before, marked only QX Drop A4. It showed what looked like a simulated urban bombing, complete with panicked civilians, emergency responders, even news chyrons, composited into the footage. But when I searched for any record of the incident, I found nothing. No mention in local archives, no obituaries, no survivors. Either the event had never happened, or it had been projected, recorded, and broadcast into selective reality, the way a magician misdirects the audience's gaze. That's when the twist I'd tried not to consider came into full view. What if this wasn't just a test gone wrong? What if it was a controlled misdirection, not to fool enemies, but to manage us, to rewrite shared events, steer fear, fabricate consensus reality? The holograms weren't merely faked accidents, they were replacements, substitutes for something else we were never meant to see. In that moment, the personal fallout crystallized. I could no longer trust my own memory of public events, could no longer dismiss coincidences as harmless. And worse, I couldn't speak of any of it without sounding insane. The truth wasn't just dangerous, it was perfectly unbelievable. It's strange how silence becomes its own kind of gravity. After everything, after the job loss, the surveillance, the disintegrating traces of what I uncovered, I didn't feel like a whistleblower or a crusader. I just felt tired. I moved often, sometimes across states, never staying long enough to register utility bills in my name. Over time, my fear settled into something quieter. Vigilance without urgency. The world didn't end. No one knocked on me. My door in the night, and yet I knew with a clarity I couldn't explain that I'd been marked in some file buried deeper than the one I'd stumbled into years ago. Occasionally, I see shadows of Nemesis SR in the news, a blurred explosion in a war zone with no verifiable footage, a missing plane that leaves no wreckage, only confirmation from unnamed officials. These aren't smoking guns, just cold patterns. I don't record them anymore. I don't chase. There was a time when I believed people deserved to know the truth, that exposure would lead to reform or outrage or justice. But Nemesis wasn't built to fool everyone. It was built to fool enough and to make the rest of us doubt ourselves, just long enough for the moment to pass. That's its real brilliance. Not the projections or radar sinks, but the erosion of certainty. I've come to accept that some things are too elegantly designed to be unmasked by one person, especially someone like me, technically skilled but politically disposable. Still, on quiet nights, I sometimes return to the hollowed heater, where the second disc remains untouched. I haven't watched it in years, but I can't bring myself to destroy it either. It's not evidence anymore. It's a reminder, not of what I found, but of the thin membrane separating what we see from what we believe. And that, I think, is what scares me most. Not that we're being lied to, but that reality itself has become programmable, consensual, like a story whose authors will never meet. The illusion isn't in the holograms or the doctored crashes. It's in the silence that follows them. That's where the real story ends, not with revelation, but with the quiet, perfect disappearance of doubt. When I first arrived at Outpost Helion, nestled along the outer rim of Sector 9, everything felt clean, efficient, and oddly impersonal. Exactly what you'd expect from a deep space research facility run under Joint Earth Coalition command. Our work focused on a highly promising biotech protocol, a cure derived from microbial samples found in the crust of asteroid Juno Tau, something we called Project Althea. The name had a comforting ring meant to symbolize healing and renewal, and on the surface, that's exactly what it offered. Rapid tissue regeneration, immune correction, even cognitive sharpness in test subjects. No one questioned why it worked so well, only how quickly it could be brought back to Earth. Our days settled into a rhythm of sterile lab routines, data collection, and long silences broken only by the occasional dry humor of our team lead, Dr. Travek. It was a strangely peaceful existence, if a bit hollow, like living inside the humming belly of a machine. But about 6 weeks in, I noticed something peculiar, subtle enough that I might have brushed it off if it hadn't happened twice in the same day. First, during a routine ocular scan, the biometric gate took 3 seconds longer to verify me. Not much, just long enough to feel it, like the system hesitated. I joked that it must be picking up my lack of sleep, but the technician barely chuckled, already moving on. That afternoon, while logging cellular growth metrics from batch 47, I glanced at my reflection in the darkened glass of the quarantine hood. The lighting made it hard to see clearly, but my pupils looked off. Not smaller, not larger, just slightly less human, more like a ring of fine, silvery pinpricks radiating out from the iris. I blinked, shook my head, blamed the glare, and told myself I was being dramatic. That's how these things start, not with sirens or shadowy figures, but with tiny imperfections in the fabric of your routine. You shrug them off because everything else still feels normal, but something inside you has already clocked the change, filed it away. I didn't say anything that day. I went to dinner with the others, made small talk about solar flare patterns and reactor upgrades, and stared too long at my hands under the cafeteria lights. There was a strange calm in the air, as if the outpost itself had grown quiet to listen, to watch. I remember that detail more than any other. The silence pressing in just slightly too close, like the station knew something we didn't. I went to bed uneasy, not afraid, just aware in a way I hadn't been before. Something had shifted. Something small, but irreversible. It wasn't until the third anomaly that I started keeping a private log. Not the official research notes, those were scrutinized and shared across departments, but a hidden thread buried under layers of encrypted tags in my personal console cache. What triggered it was a systems check I ran late one night. when the central AI began auto-adjusting our lab's ambient humidity without explanation. The environment controls were set to locked parameters, so changes required authorization, yet the logs showed no manual override. I flagged it to Travek, who mumbled something about calibration drift and told me to get some sleep. I let it go, but something about the way he avoided eye contact felt rehearsed. Over the next week, I started comparing archived biometric scans. Our own, not the lab animals. Everyone on the team underwent regular full-spectrum imaging, supposedly to track exposure limits and early stress markers. What I found made my throat tighten. Subtle but consistent morphological shifts across all subjects. Bone density increases, microvascular restructuring in extremities, slight but measurable changes in neural conductivity. At first I thought maybe it was side effect data we'd overlooked in our excitement, but it didn't add up. The changes weren't random, they were coordinated, engineered, and more disturbing still, they weren't listed in any of the summary reports sent back to Earth. I searched back through the logs, and that's when I found the edit trails, metadata showing files being rewritten, sometimes seconds after being saved. Someone, or something, was scrubbing the truth from our records. I began running my own isolated backups, unplugged from the mainframe, hidden inside obsolete maintenance drones stored in Bay 6. My logs grew more detailed, my entries more frantic. As patterns emerged I couldn't ignore, timing correlations between our inoculation cycles and the biometric shifts, a delayed response curve that matched too perfectly to be coincidence. There was a clear sequence to the transformation, slow, enough not to trigger alarms, but deliberate. The kicker came when I noticed an old technician's badge ID still being pinged by the system, Karlan Dusek, a software engineer who supposedly transferred off station 3 months prior, only there was no exit record, no transfer logs, and the comms registry still showed pings from his ID in restricted sections of the biosciences wing. I sent a message to his old coalition address. It bounced back, marked inactive. That night, I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling of my bunk, replaying every conversation I'd had over the past few weeks, every casual dismissal and hollow reassurance. The silence I'd noticed before wasn't just eerie anymore, it felt complicit, like the station was hiding something and I had just cracked the first layer. By the time I traced the full sequence of biometric shifts to the inoculation schedule, the pattern was undeniable. Each injection we'd taken as part of the so-called preventative program had triggered a distinct, timed stage of physiological change. It started with minor neuromuscular enhancements, then sensory recalibration, followed by alterations in cell oxygenation efficiency, traits that had no logical connection to the immune-boosting claims we'd been sold. I didn't know what disturbed me more, the implications of what was happening to us, or the realization that every person on the station, including myself, had accepted it all without protest. We were scientists, trained to question, to verify, but something had dulled our instincts. I reviewed the team's private messages stored in the comm buffer, old logs and casual notes. They all read the same. Oddly bland, emotionally flat, as if everyone had gradually become detached from themselves. Even my own messages felt foreign, like they'd been written by someone else wearing my skin. The worst part came when I managed to decrypt a backup transmission protocol hidden deep within the AI's peripheral drives. It wasn't coalition code, it bore an unregistered signature string, non-terrestrial in structure, recursive patterns that mimicked language but carried layered instructions instead. It was a communication protocol, but not human. Embedded in the payload were sequences tied directly to our gene therapy packets. Not only were we being modified, the instructions for those modifications weren't designed here. I dug deeper, pulling in old research from pre-expansion black site leaks, fringe conspiracy stuff at first glance, but it began to line up. Reports of alien microbial samples recovered decades ago, not just studied, but reverse engineered. It wasn't hard to guess what had happened. The sample from Juno Tau wasn't a random find. It was planted, or worse, it had waited. Project Althea was never about healing. It was about preparation, transformation, colonization. I stared at the screen, the alien code slowly pulsing with an eerie rhythm, and felt something tighten in my chest. Not fear exactly, but an alien certainty blooming inside me, as though I had already accepted some truth I wasn't ready to name. It was no longer just about uncovering a conspiracy. It was about understanding how far it had already gone, and whether there was anything human left in us to stop it. The access tunnel to sub-level Theta had been sealed since before I arrived, officially condemned due to atmospheric instability, after a core leak during the station's early construction. But the deeper I investigated, the more I found traces of recent activity, status logs that refreshed weekly, environmental sensors that pinged silently in the background, and security cams that blinked back online for brief, encrypted intervals. It took me nearly 3 days to reroute a bypass through an old maintenance drone interface, using fragments of Karlan Dusek's ghosted credentials. When the hatch finally hissed open, I descended alone, armed only with a filtered mask, a low-band torch, and a recorder set to passive mode. The air down there was still, almost too clean, and the lights flickered as if hesitant to acknowledge my presence. The corridor stretched longer than the station's schematics allowed, an architectural impossibility no one upstairs had noticed or admitted to. I followed the path, past darkened observation windows, half-scratched warning placards, and clusters of outdated biocontainment units, their display panels still humming faintly with residual power. What struck me most was how intact everything remained, as if it had been used recently and then hurriedly abandoned. In the final chamber, behind a series of redundant containment doors, I found what I can only describe as a growth chamber. Not for microbes, but for something far more complex. Along the walls were sealed columns containing tissue cultures suspended in biogel, each one tagged with a name I recognized, every person on the station, including mine. The samples pulsed faintly, alive, developing. On a nearby terminal, I found time-stamped entries in the same recursive alien syntax I'd decoded before, this time accompanied by overlapping human annotations. Someone had been interpreting the instructions, refining them, integrating them into the inoculation sequence. There were references to host compatibility, to adaptive imprinting, and most disturbingly, to neurological calibration thresholds. I recorded everything, every file, every image, and left quickly, my breath catching with the cold realization that our transformation wasn't just incidental, it was being curated. We weren't test subjects, we were prototypes. The further I climbed back toward the main decks, the more foreign my body began to feel. Not painful, just subtly altered, more efficient somehow. My vision sharpened in the dark, my footsteps quieter than they should have been. I didn't know if it was the adrenaline or something deeper taking hold, but I realized I couldn't trust my own senses anymore. Sub-level theta hadn't just shown me what was being done, it had proven how far gone we already were. And the real question, the one I could no longer ignore, was whether we were transforming into something survivable or something meant to replace us entirely. I spent the next 48 hours in a state of careful panic, hiding my findings behind layers of obfuscation within the AI's unused translation modules. Old language packs no one monitored anymore. Every part of me wanted to confront Travek, or someone, anyone, but a voice I couldn't shake kept whispering that it was too late for direct confrontation. The truth had metastasized into the station's infrastructure, woven into our routines, our protocols, our very biology. I couldn't trust my colleagues anymore, not because I thought they were malicious, but because they might not be fully themselves. I wasn't even sure I was. The way I moved now, the way I thought, even my dreams, they had all started shifting towards something more ordered, more precise. It terrified me how natural it felt. Still, I had to try. I compiled a data packet, images from sub-level theta, logs of the unauthorized edits, recordings of the alien syntax layers, and coded it into a subharmonic transmission protocol, an archaic communication format used only in early spaceflight. It was slow, clumsy, and obsolete, which made it perfect. I intended to bounce the signal off a dormant relay satellite drifting just beyond the station's shield perimeter, a relic no one had touched in years. But as I neared the comms array under the pretense of running routine diagnostics, I noticed that access logs had already been triggered. Someone had beaten me to it. The relay had been used exactly once in the past month, and the signal wasn't outbound, it was inbound. Something had contacted us first. My pulse pounded in my ears as I scrubbed the logs clean and aborted the upload. If the signal I'd found was part of the original plan, then any attempt to expose the truth could trigger a response I couldn't predict. I started noticing people watching me longer than they used to. Travek's tone turned oddly formal, and the normally sluggish AI began responding to me with unnerving speed, as if anticipating my commands. The paranoia grew sharper, more vivid, until I couldn't tell whether it was my mind or the transformation amplifying my instincts. I stopped eating with the others. I locked my door at night. I wore gloves at all times, afraid someone might feel the difference in my skin. At one point, I caught myself speaking in the alien cadence under my breath, the syllables instinctive, intimate. That was the moment I knew I couldn't wait much longer. Whether I succeeded or not, I had to send the packet. I had to try and tell someone, anyone, that Sector 9 wasn't just a research facility. It was the front line of a silent invasion, and we were its first wave, walking proof of what comes next. I transmitted the packet just after 300 station. Time during a scheduled ion flare blackout that temporarily disrupted the primary sensor array, a narrow window I couldn't risk missing. The process took 6 minutes, and in that span, I watched the relay status light blink in slow, deliberate rhythm, each flash a countdown to a moment I wasn't sure I'd survive. I returned to my quarters without incident, though I felt the weight of something unspoken pressing against the corridor walls, as if the station itself sensed the betrayal. For a while, nothing happened. No alarms, no lockdowns, not even a raised eyebrow from Trevec or the command AI. I started to think maybe I'd succeeded. Maybe the data had slipped past whatever surveillance grid they'd built into the system. But later that day, during a calibration meeting, Dr. Rennie, a normally quiet biologist, tilted her head toward me just slightly and asked, "Do you feel it yet?" I froze. She didn't elaborate, just held my gaze for a second too long before returning to her notes. That night, my console was locked. My logs were missing. Even the files hidden in the translation modules were gone, overwritten with meaningless telemetry data. Someone knew. I couldn't sleep. My bones ached in a way that didn't feel like fatigue. And when I looked in the mirror, my pupils shimmered faintly in the dark, reflecting the overhead light with a spectral sheen. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't monstrous. It was quiet, seamless, an elegance of design I hadn't appreciated before. I still felt like myself, but it was a self I could no longer define, a version threaded with alien precision and something else I didn't want to name. That's when the dreams started in earnest, not fragmented impressions, but structured sequences, memories that didn't belong to me, of worlds with red oceans and cities suspended in magnetic skies. The worst part wasn't how vivid they were. It was how familiar they felt. I realized then that the transformation wasn't just physical, it had a purpose, a directive. And part of me had already started aligning with it. I stopped trying to resist after that. Not because I gave up, but because I wasn't sure what I was fighting anymore. The station didn't retaliate. There was no punishment, no isolation, no erasure, just a quiet acknowledgement. I had done what it wanted, tested the boundaries, exposed the limits of my autonomy, and proven just how far the integration had come. In trying to warn someone, I had confirmed its success. I was no longer the observer. I was the result. I don't know if the transmission ever reached anyone. No reply came, no signal echoed back across the silence of deep space. And eventually, I stopped checking. The days stretched into a kind of ritual stasis, each one indistinguishable from the last. Yet I was no longer afraid of the changes. They had settled into me like a second language, instinctive and unspoken. My skin didn't glow, my bones didn't reshape into alien geometry, and yet everything about me had become subtly optimized. I moved differently now, thought differently. My memories felt layered, not overwritten, but recontextualized, like chapters of a book that had been edited to fit a larger narrative I could only glimpse in fragments. The others seemed to shift as well, not in overt ways, but in behavior, in harmony. There was less talking, more anticipation. We understood each other without speaking, not because of any psychic link, but because our thinking had converged. We had become a collective of shared silence, each of us aware of the transformation, yet unbothered by its implications. I never saw Carlin again, not even a trace. It's possible he was taken early, or maybe he was never real to begin with, just an echo planted to draw the curious forward. Trevec grew quieter too, his authority gradually dissolving, as if it had been a temporary placeholder until something more efficient took hold. The station continued to function, maintained itself with eerie precision, and no new personnel ever arrived. We were left in orbit, suspended in a loop, perhaps forgotten, perhaps preserved. I sometimes wonder if that was always the point, not invasion, not replacement, but preparation. A seed colony, not of bodies, but of minds calibrated to resonate, with something waiting beyond human comprehension. Occasionally I still access my old log entries, not to revisit them, but to study the tone, the cadence, the voice I used to have. It feels foreign now. There's a faint ache in remembering who I was, curious, defiant, afraid. But that part of me is distant, like a photograph of someone I once knew but can't quite name. If Earth ever receives the transmission, I don't know what they'll make of it. Maybe they'll dismiss it as corrupted data, or maybe it will awaken something dormant in them too. In either case, we've passed a threshold here at Helion, quietly, irreversibly. We're still ourselves, in the way a river is still water, even as its course is redirected by time and stone. Whatever we've become, it began not with a scream but with silence. And in that silence, something older than fear has taken root. I wasn't supposed to be in the archive that afternoon. The curator had stepped out for lunch, and I had a window, just under an hour, to photograph a set of pre-dynastic Egyptian carvings for my dissertation notes. My access was unofficial, but not unusual. Graduate students like me often leaned on familiarity with museum staff to slide past formal protocol. I moved quietly through the low-lit corridor of the basement archives, past rows of catalogued artifacts encased in sealed drawers and marked boxes. Dust filtered lazily through the air like the breath of the past itself. It was in one of the unlabeled trays, partially hidden beneath a crumpled linen cloth, that I saw it, a fist-sized metallic object, blackened with age but perfectly symmetrical. At first I thought it was a modern intrusion, something misfiled from an industrial exhibit, but the surface, once cleared of dust, revealed something else entirely. It wasn't corroded like iron or copper, and didn't gleam like aluminum or steel. It had an odd, matte sheen, like graphite, but heavier. Geometric etchings ran across its curved surface with a kind of microscopic precision, the kind that suggested machine tooling. Yet its form resembled no known tool or adornment. I felt the strange weight of it in my palm, not just physical, but psychological, like holding a lie too heavy to speak. The tray bore no registration tag, no inventory code, only a faded handwritten note taped to the side. Do not display item Z. I stood there, listening to the hum of the building's old air system, suddenly aware of the quiet in a way I hadn't been moments before. The object didn't fit, not historically, not contextually. My gut told me it wasn't Egyptian or even remotely ancient in the way we understood the word. And yet the patina on it, the layers of mineralization, spoke to age beyond comprehension. I slipped it into my backpack gently, as if afraid it might react to the motion. I didn't think of theft or consequence, only questions. And how some questions once asked change everything you thought you knew about the world. I waited 2 days before I examined it again, this time alone in my apartment under the cold glow of a desk lamp, the blinds drawn as if I instinctively feared being watched. The object hadn't changed in appearance, but something about it felt more assertive now, like it occupied space with intention. I set it on a folded towel and took high-resolution photos from every angle, uploading them to a private folder on my laptop. The first oddity came when I tried running image analysis software, a tool I'd used countless times to identify symbols on ancient ceramics. This time, the software crashed, not just once, but every time the object was included in the dataset. Curious and now mildly unsettled, I tried uploading the images to a metadata reader online, hoping to extract something, anything that might give me a lead. The upload failed, then my Wi-Fi dropped, then my entire machine rebooted. When it came back on, the folder with the photos was gone. I stared at the screen, breathing slowly, pulse rising, and tried again, this time isolating just one photo and copying it onto a USB drive. That too became corrupted the moment I plugged it in. It wasn't until I used an old offline laptop, one that had no network drivers installed, that I made any progress. The analysis yielded nothing identifiable, but something in the file's hex data caught my attention. A repeated string of numbers embedded in each image file, even those I hadn't touched. A pattern. I transcribed the numbers manually, 32 digits in total, and ran them through every format I could think of. Timestamps, coordinates, binary. Nothing coherent emerged until I input the string into a spectrogram visualization tool, normally used for audio files. The image that emerged wasn't audio at all, but resembled a waveform, a low, repeating pulse. The rhythm was mechanical, consistent, too regular to be natural. I zoomed in further and found that the pulses weren't just signals, but encoded segments. Each section contained a smaller sequence, an embedded series of digits decreasing over time. A countdown. I watched the last sequence tick down by a fraction, a value so small it might have been missed entirely had I not been staring. I couldn't understand what it was counting down to or from, but I knew this wasn't ancient in the way we categorize artifacts. This thing wasn't just dormant, it was alive in a way, or at least still functioning. And it was communicating, just not with us. Not yet. I spent the next week consumed by research, neglecting everything else: sleep, meals, even my university, responsibilities. The object sat untouched in a drawer lined with copper mesh, a crude Faraday cage I built out of paranoia more than science, though I didn't know what I was protecting it from, or what I was protecting myself against. I began scouring obscure forums and digitized archaeological records, not just from Egypt, but from Paleolithic and even Precambrian epochs. What I was searching for I couldn't articulate, only that I needed confirmation I wasn't alone. In seeing what this was, something impossibly old, impossibly advanced, and entirely out of place. It was in a declassified Soviet-era catalogue, hidden in a PDF, buried inside a forgotten Russian academic archive, that I found something chilling. It's grainy photo from 1958 of an object nearly identical to mine, reportedly excavated during the Tunguska forest soil studies. The accompanying notes were sparse, and the object was dismissed by the report's author as possible Cold War debris, though the photo clearly predated any known Soviet satellite launches. That led me to a reference in a private anthropology blog describing an anomalous metallic egg found in a collapsed cave system in Argentina in the 1970s. No coordinates, no verification, just a brief mention and a broken link. The descriptions were always vague, always dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications, but the accounts were consistent. A matty black, geometrically etched object discovered far from human settlement. always with no signs of accompanying tools or civilization. More disturbing were the rumors posted in obscure conspiracy forums, usually ignored or mocked, claiming the objects emitted information fields that altered local data streams, caused sensor malfunctions, or influenced perception in subtle ways. What terrified me most wasn't that people had seen this before. It was that every known instance ended the same way. The artifact vanished. No follow-up, no published studies, no records after the initial discovery. It was as if the moment someone got too close, the trail went cold. Deliberately, I began to suspect that what I had wasn't simply an archaeological mystery, but a kind of sentinel, a probe maybe, something planted. And as the countdown ticked forward in imperceptible increments, days, years, centuries, a question kept haunting me, not as a scientist, but as a human being. What happens when it reaches zero? It was a forgotten reference in a footnote that finally gave me a place to go, a mention of an abandoned radar facility decommissioned in 1993, located deep in the Scottish Highlands, where a similar object had allegedly been transported for analysis before the entire site was shuttered and wiped from official records. It was only thanks to a retired technician's blog, archived via the Wayback Machine, that I found coordinates, though they were incomplete, corrupted with missing digits. I cross-referenced what little I had with satellite images and topographical maps, and after weeks of planning, I booked a flight, then rented a car, and drove the rest of the way on roads that narrowed into gravel and finally disappeared into forest. The hike took the better part of a day. The facility was not visible until I created a ridge and looked down into a shallow valley. There, obscured by overgrowth and years of weather, stood a squat concrete structure with rusted satellite dishes, collapsed like dying flowers around it. The entrance had been welded shut long ago, but a side wall had cracked enough to slip through. Inside, the air smelled of mold and time. Graffiti covered most of the walls, some of it profane, some disturbingly symbolic. Spirals, triangles intersecting with eye-like glyphs, as though someone had been drawing what they saw in dreams. The deeper I went, the more signs I found that this place hadn't been entirely abandoned. A rusted cot in a corner, a stack of canned food decades expired, notebooks filled with paranoid scrawl, numbers, phrases always returning to the idea of the cycle and arrival. In the lowest level, behind a rusted door marked Restricted Level C, I found the chamber. Its floor was scorched, as if something had burned not outward, but inward. The metal walls bore streaks of an oily residue that shimmered under flashlight, and in the center, bolted to the ground, was an empty frame, square, with clamps designed to hold something fist-sized, my object, or one like it. On a wall-mounted terminal, long dead, I found an old printer tray filled with dusty printouts, graphs, data logs, and a final sheet with a crude ASCII rendering of a countdown, eerily similar to what I had seen in the spectrogram. Below it was a handwritten note in red ink. When it reaches zero, we won't remember what we lost. I stood in that silence for a long time, unsure whether the fear I felt came from the chamber itself or from something the object had already planted in me. I returned home with the object sealed in 3 layers of shielding, my laptop wiped and reinstalled from scratch, and a growing sense that time, whatever time meant now, was slipping away from me. The countdown wasn't linear, I'd realized. It sped up imperceptibly with each day, responding perhaps to observation or proximity, as though its purpose became more urgent the more I understood it. I compiled everything into an offline report, my notes, the spectrograms, the historical anomalies, the photos of the facility. I wrote it all like a paper, structured like any other academic study, but it read more like a warning. I debated for days whether to publish it anonymously, send it to journalists, or approach someone within the academic world I still had tenuous ties to. But each scenario played out in my mind with the same outcome: silencing, ridicule, or worse. I tested the waters by sharing a sanitized version with an old professor I trusted, omitting key details. He responded 2 days later with a vague email about burnout and taking a leave of absence. His university profile was deleted a week later. I called his office. Disconnected. I started receiving strange calls, no caller ID, no voice on the line, just a faint static, rhythmic, like a machine breathing. My apartment began to feel like a place under surveillance. I took to carrying the object with me everywhere, wrapped in lead foil, buried at the bottom of a decoy electronics case. I don't know if I did this out of paranoia or instinct, but I knew I couldn't leave it behind. I met with a freelance journalist one night in a cafe, someone who'd written about classified archaeology and been laughed out of 3 publications. I thought I could trust her. I was wrong. She listened intently, asked good questions, then went silent for 3 days. Her blog was wiped clean the next time I checked. A placeholder message said, "Domain no longer available." I knew then that exposure wasn't an option, not in the way I'd imagined. Someone, or something, had been scrubbing every mention of this artifact for decades. The only real choice left was whether to keep running with it or try to disappear. But even that seemed futile. The object wasn't just hidden history, it was a signal, a kind of cosmic trigger. And whatever force had embedded it into our timeline hadn't just anticipated discovery, it required it. The realization came not as a revelation, but as a slow and terrible settling, like the way a room darkens not because a light is switched off, but because the sun has quietly slipped beneath the horizon. The countdown, I finally understood, was not measuring time in a way we experience it. It wasn't counting hours or seconds or even linear events. It was tracking awareness, ours collectively. Every mention, every digital trace, every curious glance or idle theory nudged it forward, like attention itself was fueling it. The object responded to observation the way radioactive particles decay under scrutiny, but with purpose. I had been feeding it. We all had, and now I had to make a choice, to suppress everything I'd learned, or to accept that the final moment, 0, would come sooner because of me. I watched the counter on my isolated terminal accelerate in barely perceptible shifts, not by minutes, but by digits so fine only the machine could track them. My hands trembled as I copied the last iteration of data into a notebook and then destroyed the drives, incinerating them one by one in a borrowed metal barrel behind my building. I barely slept. I stopped going outside. I no longer trusted reflections, electronics, or even the comfort of my own voice. I tried to forget what I knew, to unknow it, to starve the object of my recognition. But it was too late. One night I woke from a half-sleep to find the object on the table glowing faintly, not with light, but with a presence that pressed against the inside of my skull, like a thought too large to hold. The waveform had stabilized now into something almost beautiful, like the soft bell curve of a tide about to break. I had the sudden, irreversible sense that when it reached zero, the world would not end in fire or noise, but in disorientation so complete that we wouldn't recognize what had changed. That maybe it already had. I spent my final coherent days assembling a kind of manual, handwritten, coded, scattered in notebooks placed in libraries and thrift stores, hidden in the cracks of the analog world where digital eyes might miss them. I never gave it a name, never claimed authorship. I only left enough for someone else to notice the patterns, to start again, to maybe delay the next approach. And then I let go. I locked the object in a lead-lined box, sealed it in resin, and buried it where no signal could follow. I moved across the country under a new name and began forgetting, deliberately, painstakingly, until even my own memories felt like fiction written in someone else's hand. Some days I still feel it, like a pressure behind the sky, subtle and unrelenting. I don't dream the way I used to. There are stretches of sleep that vanish entirely, and mornings when I wake up with phrases in my head that don't belong to me. Words in dead languages, coordinates I don't recognize, sequences of numbers I force myself not to write down. The life I've built is quiet now. I teach part-time under a borrowed name, avoid technology when I can, and live in a cottage where radio signals barely reach. To anyone else I look like a man who left academia, for peace, for solitude, maybe even to escape some unspoken disgrace, and I let them believe that. Letting go was supposed to be the end of it, but I've come to realize the object was never mine to lose or keep. I was only one node in a much larger pattern, one that stretches across time, geography, even thought itself. I sometimes read stories online of strange findings, a sculptor in Italy who carves the same spiral patterns without knowing why, a young girl in Chile who hums a melody that, when visualized, matches the pulse of the countdown exactly. These fragments float around the edges of our world like driftwood from a wreck we've already forgotten. And I wonder if the object truly stopped counting, or if it simply began measuring something else, something more insidious than time. Not a reset in the sense of annihilation, but erasure, the removal of context, the soft rewriting of history, until what was true can no longer be proven, only doubted. That's how it works, I think. Not with destruction, but with forgetting. I haven't seen the object since I buried it, haven't dared to go near it. But I know, with the certainty of instinct, that it's still there, waiting. Not for me, but for whoever comes next, and if they find it, they'll think they're the first. That's the cruelest part. We never remember that we've already failed.